Okay, so this video is for the diving specific portion of our Australia adventure. We were on the Spoil Sport by Mike Ball Divers, and it was phenomenal. We took the 7-day Coral Sea plus Great Barrier Reef tour, and I would highly recommend this to anyone from early advanced to advanced divers. So, after boarding and getting our champagne and seeing our fabulous rooms, we set off in the night. For the most part, the boat is going to be driving at night. You're going to be moving from site to site. Also, the video in the background for these is just going to be kind of random dive footage over the course of me talking, but as I talk about specific areas, I will put annotations in the video that this dive lines up with what I'm talking about so that you can put eyes to where we are. That said, I only took GoPro from one dive a day. I actually enjoy dives more when I'm not filming, so I try and mix it up a little bit. So we were doing on average probably 3.5 dives a day. So there's GoPro from everything, but not really. So it is what it is. So our first stop on our dives trip was Holmes Reef, which is an offshore reef about 130 miles off the shore of Australia, much further than the Great Barrier Reef, and it pretty much pops up out of nothing. So a lot of blue around it and this crazy reef just out in the middle of nowhere. As a whole, I wasn't aware that we were going to be going out this far. It's definitely the furthest from shore I've been on a boat, and as a result, I think that it's a good idea to be a little more conservative in your diving because it's a long way to a hospital. We did 4 dives on Holmes Reef. The first 2 were on a site called Nonki Bami, which is a pinnacle, and so it was nice to have this site to kind of just get your gear settled and figure out what it's like to dive in Australia. That said, the life here was great, and the viz here was amazing. All of the offshore reefs had easily over 100-foot visibility, and the site was included. We saw a lot of jacks, big schools of jacks, white-tip sharks, barracuda, um, and this was a great way to start the trip. The second site we went to on Holmes Reef was called Amazing, and it was pretty much that. So our first dive there was pretty epic. We saw a leopard shark, and we later got schooled by white tips on the way in. The viz here was probably the best visibility I've had on any dive ever. For the most part, we were one of the first divers or dive team into the water. I feel that you see more and get to experience more when things aren't spooked, and that certainly held true on this trip. A good example of that is the leopard shark, which you can see here. My motto is let sleeping sharks lie, and maybe some of the other divers are not as prudent in staying as far away. So the dive team that showed up after we filmed the leopard shark got a little too close, spooked it, and here it is swimming back away from us. Um, After that, we did a second dive on Amazing at night, and there's no footage of this dive, but saw the first eel of the trip on this one, and it was a pretty nifty dive to cruise around the reef. A lot of shrimp, a lot of crustaceans, but it's always interesting to see how the reef changes on a night dive, and Um, Amazing changed a lot, and it was cool to see. Overnight, we drove 85 miles to the north to a place called Bougainville Reef and promptly awoke to what was going to be our first drift dive of the trip. So, our first site at Bougainville Reef is a site called Middle Earth, and we were diving this as a drift. So, the spoil sport has multiple tender boats, which are rigid body inflatables with little outboards on the back. So they load about 8 divers into these. They book you up the reef wall, and then you all do a back roll and drift back to the anchor, which is hooked up to their moorings. All of the sites that they did not ever, I feel, drop an anchor that wasn't a bow anchor. They usually hook the stern up to an existing built-in mooring, and this site was the case. That usually means that there is something for you at the end of the line. This one was a little bit weird because there wasn't a very strong current, so it was kind of a one-directional swim rather than a drift, and we were pretty close to being done with our dive by the time that we made it back to the rope. Um, the site itself was one of my favorites. It has a ton of swim throughs and cracks in the wall that you can kind of go up and explore, and you'll immediately get out of the current once you go into one of these. And there was not as much life. We did see some gray reef sharks. We did see some big barracudas on this site, but it was more about the coral and the topography. The topography here was really interesting. Again, a lot of tight spaces. This is a site where you really need your buoyancy nailed to um, to be able to not bump into things, and both Christine and I felt, did very well navigating this site. The second Bougainville site was Crystal Plateau, and this site was pretty interesting. There was a lot of current here, where there wasn't much current on our drift dive. On our last 2 dives, we had a lot of current. That said, once this site kind of is a bunch of canyons that are draining off into a wall. On the wall, there is tons of current. Up in the canyons, it wasn't that bad. There was a lot of interesting life here, mostly on the potato cod side, but when we got further up the canyons, we saw a big school of barracuda, and then past them, we saw the first tunas of the trip, and they were dogtooth tunas. Um, we turned and kind of just drifted back down the canyon and had a somewhat drift dive after not having one at the last site. And when we made it back to the rope to go up, we were kind of just hanging like a flag and letting us lay out in the very heavy current heading back. But the cool thing on the flag was to watch 2 dogtooth tunas that were mating, and they were just screaming across the wall, and it was very cool to see. The third Bougainville site was called Dungeons and Dragons, and this site was kind of a mix between the last two. It had a lot of swim throughs, like the drift dive at Middle Earth, and it had a little bit more life, like we were seeing on the Crystal Plateau. Um, on this site, I ended up breaking my BCD, and we had to end a little bit early. I went to dump the butt dump, and as you can see here, it came off in my hand. That said, we did get a pretty good dive in before that happened, and the BC wasn't completely unusable. It just was probably not going to hold air at the surface, so I wanted to make sure that I had plenty of air in case something happened. So I turned it a little early, and Christine didn't really understand what was going on, but realized that I wanted to go back up the rope. I kind of missed the rope, as you can see here as we come out through the swim through, but she does point it out to me, and eventually we go and do our safety stop. We took a couple selfies and head back to the boat. Um, the chief engineer on the boat, Richard, would later help me glue this butt dump back together, and I have a picture of it here after it's been glued. The part that broke is just this $5 piece that goes inside the BC bladder and seals to the outside, and I ended up breaking two of these on the trip, as you'll soon find out. So overnight we drove again, and we continued north up to Osprey Reef, which is the northernmost of the offshore reefs we dove. Our first dive in Osprey Reef was at a site called False Entrance, and that's because you can't quite make it into the center of the lagoon from this site. It doesn't quite get deep enough to make it in. The true entrance to the lagoon is much north. This turned out to be the deepest dive of the trip so far at 83 feet deep. You could have gone much more than that at all of these sites, but we didn't really see the need for that. The shark streak continued. We have so far seen a shark on all of our dives, and this site was interesting, but at this point starting to get a little typical. The next site of Osprey was the shark feed, and this is quite the interesting dive. Going into this, I didn't really anticipate that I would enjoy the shark feed too much. I've heard a lot of stories on the scuba forums about how terrible these things are, and how they're teaching sharks that divers equals food, and etc. I think that this was conducted very responsibly for what it is. I'm still a little conflicted in if I had chosen the itinerary, I probably would not include these, but it does make for stunning footage, and it does pretty much guarantee that you'll get a lot of action. And so overall, I had a lot of fun on this dive. It was really easy to film. You're just kind of seated for the first half of the dive where they're doing the shark stuff, as you can see here. They release the tuna heads float up, the sharks go crazy, and right now we need to pause because just to the right, as the tuna heads come up, a whale shark cruises by, and probably 3/4 of the divers do not see it because they're focused on the sharks biting the tuna heads, and myself and Christine are included because that's a pretty crazy sight. Why would we be looking to the right? But it did go by, and we did miss it, and it was big, and it was pretty. So we can continue, and the people who did see it got to brag, and the people who missed it got to be sad. After the shark feeding frenzy was over, Yella, the trip director, gives the X signal here, and we're free to cruise around. So I got to go right up close to Mr. Potato Cod over here, and he was pretty friendly. I don't feel like he was too hungry because he didn't really jam into the shark ball too hard, and then he ended up just like sitting down next to the divers, and they were just hanging out with him for the rest of the feed. We cruise a little bit up the wall and then turn around. The most dangerous part of this dive was not the sharks that were going bananas, but actually these couple of lionfish that were underneath where everyone was sitting, and probably the worst place for some lionfish to be. So, yeah. So the next dive of Osprey was to do. You had one of two choices. You could pay to do a private photo shoot that was another shark feed, or you could do a drift dive on the western wall. As we'd only done one drift so far on this trip, and we're both pretty fond of drifts, we chose to go do the drift dive. We had a little bit more current on this one than we did on the previous, and you end pretty much in the same spot as the shark feed because that's where the boat's anchored. So a lot of life, and we definitely saw the remnants of their private shoot blow by us while we were on the wall. But overall, this was a pretty good dive, and fun to be actually drifting. Our last dive for Osprey Reef was at a site called 5/8, and we had to move sites a couple times because there was too much current in the other places to have safe dive. And so we finally rolled up on this spot, and it was pretty good. We did a pretty long dive here, just about an hour, and the big highlight of this dive was the biggest eel I've ever seen in my life. It was only about halfway out of its rock, I think, but it was about the diameter of a basketball, so he was a big boy. So that kind of concludes the offshore portion. From here, we drove to Lizard Island and dropped off some of the passengers and picked up some new passengers. And then we came back down the Great Barrier Reef, and so that will be in the next video.